Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the South Coast Artist Index. And we have another distinguished guest. All of our guests are distinguished, some more than others. I'll leave that up to them. And guest, could you please introduce yourself and spell your name?
Yes, my name is Lasse Antonsen. If you're pronouncing Danish, it's spelled Lasse and Antonsen, Antonsen.
Good. As I've repeated on nearly all the podcasts, I do that on purpose because a lot of people are just picking this up. Obviously, audio, there's no visual connection, and if they want to contact you or whatever on the fly or make a mental note, they have no idea how to spell your name. And there's also one of the things that I do used to do more often, but now just occasionally. What kind of episodes have you had with your name of people trying to pronounce it or trying to spell it? Or
I think having the name Lasse is difficult in Denmark, and in the U.S. It's a Danish name that has some vowels in it that the American ear can't really hear. So I'm used to almost any pronunciation, and that's fine.
Short of Lassie.
Yeah, that's right. That does happen too.
That's happened too. Yeah, we all have. Just when you think it's rather obvious, it is less obvious than imagine. Let's work backwards. Where are you now in your life as an artist, as a former curator, art historian? Am I missing any titles?
No.
Okay. Where are you now, and where are you going? And we'll work backwards from there.
Yeah, I think that's a way to approach it, because I am now very actively pursuing a career as an artist. And so, I'm in my 73rd year, and I live in New Bedford, and live in what's called the Rhode Works building, which is a live-work space for artists, where I live with my wife, the textile artist, Ellen Noble. But we also have a studio on Hat Street. And so in these days here, with the coronavirus and so on, we're very privileged that we can go to our studio and put in long work days there, because there's no interruption. But in many ways, my life is interesting, in maybe as an example of an artistic career, because I was born in Copenhagen in 1947, right after World War II, where Denmark was occupied by the German forces. And I guess I can say that right from I was very, very young, I was very interested in art. It was really my obsession. It was all I cared about was art, poetry, literature, culture, in a sense. And I was fortunate enough, when I was still in high school, to attend what's called the Experimental Art School in Copenhagen. I was 16, 17. I attended at night. And it was a very interesting place, because it had was sort of established as a kind of place where that was in not competition with, but alternative to the Art Academy. And unbeknownst to me, there were some very, very famous artists that were running it. And it was basically concentrating on printmaking. So I got an early exposure there to the world of art that I really longed to be part of. And I think in many ways for me early on, and that's when you want to be an artist, is that you're really looking for vocabulary. And in the early 60s, everything was kind of in flux in many ways. It was really the neo-dada period in art history. Many new roads were being investigated, including in Denmark, things like John Cage and his music and so on, chance operations. So I knew, and I was pursuing more traditional abstract imagery especially, but also interested in sort of new materials and collage. Then after that, being at the experimental art school, I went to an art school that's called Halbæk Kunsthøjskole. And it was a one-year program, and it was probably in Denmark, not probably, it was in Denmark, a parallel to Black Mountain College. We were about 30 students. We lived there for about a year. It was only artists that were teaching. And again, I was very young, didn't know much about these people, and many of these people actually became quite famous. And at that time, while I was there, it was not that you pursued any one specific thing, just like it is at Black Mountain College. There were very different things you could do. One of the important things for me was that I was in a writing seminar, which was with the Danish poet Inger Christensen and Paul Borum as a couple that were married at the time. And I was also involved with mime, actually. There's somebody who had studied mime with Marcel Marceau in Paris, who was teaching there. We were also putting on plays. Some people were creating music and so on. So it was a very fertile period of time. And the age group was probably from between 17, I was 17, up to probably, I think, something like 37. So it was a wide range of people. And looking back, I can see that there was so much going on at once. And I was with some people that later became very, very famous in Denmark in the Danish context. Like the poet Henrik Nordbrandt. It's not a big name in the US, but one of the biggest poets we have in Denmark. And he almost immediately put out a collection of poetry after being there. There was a painter that really was quite extraordinary in the way his career took off, William Scott Olsen. He was also a musician and opened up for Bob Dylan when he came to Denmark. So there was a lot going on like that. Then for me in my life, things were sort of interrupted by, I was drafted. And since I was a conscientious objector, I ended up spending time in the forest doing forestry work, which is sort of another chapter of my life, but an interruption. And then at that point, I had already sort of moved into and being part of the hippie years. And sort of in 65 forward, starting smoking pot and so on, and listening to all the great music. And I began to, it was a very strange time, interesting time, because you could hitchhike all over Europe with little problem. And I started, you always, when you grow up in Europe and the cold north, you want to go to the warm south. And so I would hitchhike to Barcelona. I hitchhiked into Portugal at one point. And also twice I hitchhiked down into Morocco. And sort of for hippies at the time, you either went the eastern route and went to Kathmandu, Nepal, where some of my friends did, or you longed to get to Tangiers and to Marrakesh. And that's where I went. And I stayed in Marrakesh for a winter. And all of this was really very formative for me. And in many ways, I was not making artwork, but I can see I was preparing myself in terms of where I wanted to go in that direction. I also come sort of out of that time period. I got to know Americans, and I lived on the island for a while of Minorca, in one of the Balearic Islands in Spain. And I met a girl there, and actually my second trip to Marrakesh was with her. After that, I went up in 72 for my first visit to America and to New York. And that was quite exciting. It was a time period where a lot of things were going on. It was also, in some ways, when I look back at it, a kind of strangely sort of fallow time period, the 70s with disco and many other things. So after what I felt was the richness of the 60s and the wonderful music and so on, I just did not connect well to much of what was going on culturally at that time. And I think that was what then made me realize that I wanted to focus on becoming an art historian. So I went back to Denmark and I studied at Copenhagen University. And my interest was in many ways really to get back into, sort of solidly into the world of art. And for example, at the Copenhagen University, I had 2 graduate courses in Rembrandt and the prints and drawings of Rembrandt. We have an extraordinary collection of the prints and drawings of his. And at that time, we had a museum, a curator, who was also teaching at the University, the Copenhagen University. And we were just a group of like 10 students that would every Friday morning would sit and with gloves on, handle these beautiful drawings by Rembrandt. And that really was something that trained my eye and my mind. Erik Fischer was his name. He was just an extraordinary individual in that way. And so my longing really was at that time far more into the older art and to soak up, in a way, the quality and the sort of wisdom, I would almost call it, that there is in, for example, the work of Rembrandt. So, but that point too, I was married to an American, and I ended up coming. She really wanted to go back to the U.S. After we had lived in Copenhagen for a while. And I ended up, luckily, working for a gallery on Newbury Street. Actually, I was even a guard at the ICA for a short time. It was interesting. And then I got the job in the gallery is called Impressions. And I started taking courses at Harvard. They had excuse me, at that time, the extension program, which was really a great program. It was a lot of the Harvard professors. You know, when you're a professor, there's a lot of things you want to teach, but the department does not want you to teach that. And so the Harvard extension program was often a place where a Harvard professor could get to teach something they really loved to teach, but had not yet been allowed to teach. And there I especially studied with David Mitten, who was the curator of archaeology, fine arts and archaeology at the Ford Museum. And it was another person that was really important for me that I learned a lot from. So that was actually a very wonderful time for me in terms of being in the US. And this was when I had settled here, was in 78. So I've actually been here since 78. So from that richness, in a way I could say, I applied to different graduate schools and became a graduate student at Tufts University. There also I had some great professors, and I ended up specializing in the work of Picasso. At that point, I had actually started teaching at the museum school in Boston, and I became a research assistant at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art, which was a really wonderful period there in the 80s when they were showing a lot of work by artists like Francisco Clement and so on. That led me to becoming curator for a couple of years at the Danforth Art Museum, which is now not functioning differently from where it was then. But it was wonderful for me because they gave me very free rein to do things. And I did an exhibition of the 2 German artists, Paula Modersohn-Becker and Käthe Kollwitsch. And I did a series of installations with contemporary artists. And I also did quite wonderful show for me to do, which was with the sculptures and prints and paintings by Alberto Giacometti. And I sort of juxtaposed him with the work of Henri Michaud, which is a French poet and visual artist. And I sort of was looking at the visual component between them. And then at this point, after that, a position opened up. It was then the Southeastern Massachusetts University. And they were looking for a gallery director who could also teach in the art history department. So for me, that was the ideal position. So I arrived at the university, I think in '87. It was before it merged with the Swain School that had merged with the program of artisanry. So that was all just in the years before that. But that's sort of the local history of institutions. But it was a rich time period. And I was fortunate in that the university sort of let me write my own program. They also let me find my own money. So whatever I wanted to do, yes, you do it, but you find the money for it. But it was a time where you could write grants, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council was very generous towards contemporary art. So I was able to do programming there that was very satisfying on many levels. And over the years, I showed a series of very important female American artists like Anna Mendieta, Nancy Spiro, and more bigger names like Frank Stella, for example, and so on. So over a 25-year period, I got to show a lot of different artists and interacting with them. So it, for me, was a very rich period. Coming in as a faculty member, I was actually the only modernist, and there weren't really that many courses on the books. So I put in additional courses, for example, courses in things like data and surrealism. I put in a course on Soviet and Russian art. I had shown Russian artists like Ilya Kapakov and other artists like that once the Cold War came to an end. And then I, again, it was interesting. I talked to you earlier about professors at Harvard not being able to maybe teach what they wanted to teach. And one thing I really realized I wanted to teach, that the department really couldn't have me teach, and other of the professors wanted to teach, was the graduate seminar for the graduate students. I more and more realized that that's where my interest was lying, was in really how to guide young artists forward in the pursuit of their career. So I was asked by RISD, by the Rhode Island School of Design, if I would teach graduate courses there. And I did that in the 90s, I think maybe for something like 7 years. But then when, of course, I had permission to do that because you have to ask for that. And then finally, the university said, well, I think we should let Lasse teach the graduate seminars. And also at that point, we had actually developed the graduate program. So there was several different courses being taught. And I could teach the one I was interested in, which really has to do with creativity. What does it mean to be creative? And what does it mean to arrive at a vocabulary? What does it mean to be part of a tradition? Because you're always part of a tradition. And how do you relate to influence? How do you consciously relate to influence and position yourself in that way? So I did that for many years. And then when I retired in 2012, I started, actually I had already started, I was teaching graduate seminars at Mass College of Art. And I really loved doing that, especially when the program was out on the Cape in Provincetown and run out of the Fine Arts Work Center, where I would meet with the students, and then it would be online. But they moved the program back to Boston eventually, and I became less interested in it. Actually, I was really interested in it because at that time, it was wonderful the way that that program really was keyed into So there's a tradition of painters on the Cape, and with an interest in the light and the sort of modernist tradition that really was early on introduced on Cape Cod in Provincetown. So for a couple of years, I have not been teaching. So in terms of my own artwork, in the 90s, I began to do different kind of work. I was really more and more sort of realizing that there was a huge satisfaction in showing a very important artist's work, like an artist like Nancy Spiro, for example, interact with them, meet with them, interview them, write about them, make catalogs and so on, and being in their world. But I also had more and more longing for my own art world. And but when you're married, have a couple of children, and they are going through school and so on, you are both teaching and creating exhibitions, a very ambitious program in Galway and so on. There wasn't much time to devote to it. But looking back, I can see some of the earliest work I did, and I found an urge to engage with, was really because of being in New Bedford. There's many ways that you begin to realize, and of course these are the things I was teaching, is how an artist really has to become part of the cultural history they're in. And New Bedford has such an incredible, extraordinary richness, and a long richness, a long history in its culture. And I had encouraged students to read the American Transcendentalists and Emerson and Thoreau. And I think part of the richness, just like when I grew up in Copenhagen, you sort of know that Kierkegaard walked the streets of Copenhagen. And there's a magnificent thinker and person that questioned life and questioned existence and engaged on such a profound level with life itself. There was a similar person here in this country, which was Thoreau. And Thoreau often came to New Bedford and had extensive relationship to it. So some of my early work was actually creating work that was related to Thoreau, who is, just to give one example, he's a wonderful writer because he's so ambiguous and he's so many things at once. And of course he had his cottage, or his hut that he lived in, that he always talked about was very Spartan. But he also wrote that he had 3 stones that he had there in the hut. And to his great horror, he realized that they were collecting dust, unlike the furniture of my mind, he writes. So he took the stones and threw them out the window. And I just thought there was such an incredible image of these stones that he threw out. What stones had he collected? Why did he collect them? We know he looked at anything that had to do with nature and so on. And I thought of them maybe almost like Chinese scholar stones. So one of the first artwork that I did was I went and found these 3 stones and put them on a shelf. And I then, had Thoreau's 3 stones that you could look at.
The actual 3 stones?
That's what everybody says. Of course not. But,
okay. I was going to say the provenance, and that would be interesting.
Yeah. You could make that artwork many times and choose many different stones, but I chose some. So anyways, I began more and more to do that kind of work, often small work and a kind of collage work, and work that engaged with history and with place, with geography and so on. And I began to show different places, make installations especially. And when I retired from the job at the university as gallery director, I had a residency in Leipzig in Germany, a 3-month residency, and that was a great experience. I'd actually had a residency before that in upstate New York, where basically all the work I did there was about Thoreau. And it was an exhibition and a residency in Casanova at the Stone Quarry Hill Art Park. But then in 2012, once I retired, I could focus on my artwork really full time. And by then, I had, I'd been divorced, and I had met Ellen Noble, the textile artist, and in many ways we both began to pursue art together. And she actually, we had just met, as I had in 2006, when I had the residency in New York, in New York State. And she came up with me there too for a little part of it. But when we went to Leipzig, she also came to Leipzig. And that was great because it was a program that was initiated by an American artist, but we were about, I think, almost over a year period. I was there for 3 months, something like close to 80 different artists from many different nationalities. So that also led to exhibitions other places. And eventually, with my contact in Leipzig, I did a big installation there in 2015 in an old power plant. So I, in many ways, had found a vocabulary that has to do with objects or creating objects that tell a story and that has a narrative in them. And this, I think, is a way that I have really enjoyed working, having that focus between the written word, which goes all the way back to me being in writing seminars at the art school I attended early on.
And
but
that point is when I first met you, and it was at the Colo Colo Gallery on Center Street.
Yeah.
And it was an error on my part. I was so psyched by what I saw, and I just ran with it. But knowing you since then, you create this acceptable reality.
Yeah, yeah.
In other words, like the three stones. Now I can see that it's not a lie. It's an acceptable reality.
Yeah.
And where, we've heard this whole story so far, but where does that come from? Is that a Danish, like the Danish fairy tales? Does it come from being a Dane, or is it?
I don't think so. It's actually something that there are a few people around that kind of create alternative stories. They are alternative histories. So it's not far from what a novelist will do, creating characters and so on. So I'm certainly not the only one who's done it. And in some ways, it has to do also with that. In many ways, if you become an artist and you become a significant artist, there is always a certain myth around you, or there is a certain amount of storytelling. There is something that places you in a context, a time period, and it gives you an aura of importance. And it doesn't matter whether it's Cy Twombly or anybody else. These things happen and they unfold, and they're true, but they are also storytelling. And and some people have just used that to further create characters. And I've been one of those that have created characters too. Or sort of an alternate reading of Thoreau's life. Yeah.
Another thing that you sparked in speaking is, the cliche of the isolation of artists. But it's not just an isolation of location or space. In other words, you're working, slaving away, as people like to call it, in your garret, in your studio. Mm-hmm. But there's also an intellectual and cultural isolation. And that I'm curious about your take on, because here, I was privileged to have lived in Europe for a year, which is more than I ever imagined I would have done. But that time really helped me see a contrast between countries in culture and intellectualism.
Yeah.
There, intellectuals are revered. Here, reviled. So if you could expound on that a bit.
Yeah, I think it's I've been one that for my students here, which of course include international students I worked with, really try to ground a student, and you can ground yourself at any time in the history and the geography and the cultural history of where you are. But at the same time, America is such a vast country. And I remember coming to, the first time I actually visited the US, it was in New York in '72. But once I came back again and I settled in the Boston area, I had expected Boston would have a thriving cultural life the way that Copenhagen has. And to my surprise, I found that it wasn't, except in the universities. And that is really the tragedy of American life in many ways. It is that you can find some of the world's best universities, and you can find extraordinary topics, films, exhibitions, and so on taking place in those surroundings and there, but it doesn't reach the common person. It doesn't reach the average person. And that's not what you have in Europe. In Europe, people are educated. They know their poets. They know the national poets. They know the national art. They know a kind of canon almost of significance. And so, in Kierkegaard, as I mentioned, people know about him and have studied him, even if you come from whatever background, even non-intellectual background. The importance of Kierkegaard as a thinker and as a person has still percolated into your life, and I think it really is necessary for us to have these sort of light posts of intellectual significance. And I think sometimes when you think about the French, for example, that one poet that every French student knows is Rimbaud. And Rimbaud is this amazing visionary 15, 16, 17-year-old writer who experimented with drugs, who was a homosexual, and who by the time that his teen years was gone too. He just disappeared up into, I think, Algeria. And yet he's revered. And that gives a tolerance, that gives an understanding of life, of the possibilities of life. It's not an example to follow, and that's not necessarily what you want, but it's an example to follow in your mind, in your thoughts, that you can pursue freedom, you can be any kind of alternative reality that you feel like pursuing, and apart from the reality you live in or with that. So that really is, it is a kind of somewhat tragic part of the US. And it confused me to begin with because, of course, when I came here, I knew Andy Warhol and other artists of that kind. I knew Jackson Pollock. And Jackson Pollock has a mythical stature for example, I realized in many Eastern European countries that were under a communist regime, to have this artist that danced around on the floor with his paint and created this world that just enveloped you was for them the absolute freedom. And they sort of absorbed him, they venerated him because they were under a repressive system. But Jackson Pollock might be maybe somebody that's a fair amount of people know, but his significance not really, except in art circles, is understood. So yes, it was baffling for me to come and find that, of course, I come from a very small culture, and I come from a country that has 5.5 million people. And I think in Massachusetts, there are like 7 or 8 million people. But still, from the point of view that I'm talking, it's kind of sad. And I have used most of my career in when I worked with undergraduate students in trying to get them to give them the material to possibly have them wake up to the significance of the life they could live and that could be lived, but that they don't really have access to. And it's strange because even though everything you could say is available on the internet and so on, it really isn't. But there are many ways that American life finds its own expressions for young people. And I find with some of my students, for example, that grunge music, garage bands and so on, was an awakening to something else. Unfortunately, often with destructive drugs as being part of it. But it's a big topic. It's a big topic how you get a rich culture.
You mentioned lamppost, which is interesting because I scribbled down two words, spotlight versus floodlight, and you're talking about the U.S. versus Europe, and it seems as though it's spotlit. Once you get to the edge of that spotlight, it's darkness. Where there in Europe, it's floodlight. It's spread more evenly. And I've said this many times on the show. Hello, how are you? What do you do? Oh, you're a painter. Have I ever seen your work? Are you hanging somewhere now? Do you have anything in publication? Here, oh, you make any money doing that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And then, as you know, because I've read you expound upon it on your Facebook posts about the anti-intellectualism that is just rampant here for some reason.
Yeah. I think actually one of the things is, because we can go a little bit into politics in that, and with Sanders, there's been a lot of talk about Denmark and Scandinavian countries and so on as a kind of socialism. It is actually not at all socialism. It is really strong capitalism, but it's a fair capitalism. It is capitalism that's sort of being tamed, and monopolies and others are being tamed by the government, so that what you are protecting is really the population. And you're protecting them which was a Danish goal always, making them middle class. So the Danes as a country, it's largely middle class. And that's an interesting thing too about the art world, that you can find there's a lot of artists, there's a lot of galleries, and a lot of people buy art. And people will buy art, and compared to here, you can actually find a very good artist, and let's say you can buy his or her work for $5,000. And you're saying, well, why, when you're so famous, are you selling for $5,000? Unless they are part of an international set of galleries and so on, then they get the prices get really high. Mm-hmm. But you can still find very good work for like $5,000. And an artist can sell it because actually the artist is protected socially. You have, you have gone to school for free. Your children are going to school for free. You have free health care. Your parents are getting into a retirement home for free, and so on. There's a lot of things that are just simply protected. And so you don't need to put that into your price, the price of your artwork. It's more important for you that it ends up somewhere. And the people, even though you hear about these high taxes, which in many ways are not higher than here, and certainly what you get back from them is amazing, has actually really resulted in there are a lot of people that will go to an art fair, and basically their, the range of what they can buy is about $5,000 worth of artwork, and they like to do that, and lower too, of course. Mm-hmm. So that's another way of looking at how an interest is spread, and when you have a culture where people are protected, this gives them time and freedom to pursue literature, writing, pursuing art on their own, and so on, music. And a wonderful part of it, too, that you might know about in Denmark is the food scene, the restaurants. Mm. We have the distinction of basically having the world's best restaurant in Copenhagen called Noma. And it's all, for me, from my perspective, an outgrowth of a kind of a life where there is that richness and possibility, economic possibility. So in many ways, some people will say to me, well, it's just like Denmark is one big private school type of, yeah, it is. It's a private school. It's paid by the government. Yeah. So here you can have these kinds of very good schools, but they're private, they're for the elite, they're for the 1%.
Yeah, another thing that, because I remember this, couple of things are coming into my mind, but coffee right now is jumped into my head. And we've had many coffees, but not enough. And the difference, the cafe society doesn't exist here.
Right.
And speaking with you, you always like trigger off things in my head. Here we have a drive-through.
Mm-hmm.
You pick up your coffee, you drink it alone.
Yeah.
You drink it over a prolonged period of time because it's so large. And I remember, what was it? One of your relatives or friends came over from Denmark, and you told me that they wanted to know why Americans walked around with coffee pots in their hands all day, and you couldn't quite understand what they were talking about until you saw somebody with a 32-ounce coffee. Which the amount of caffeine, and just a quick aside, coming over here, I couldn't understand when we'd go out for breakfast or whatever, and I had no choice but to have an American coffee, which I always had consumed black here with no sugar. Why my lips started to quiver.
Mm-hmm.
And the great lie is that the espresso is higher in caffeine because they call it a shot here.
Right.
It's actually a lie because it's lower in caffeine and so on and so forth. But again, there, the cafe,
mm-hmm.
you have a book, you have a cup of coffee. So you either solitary or you see a passerby, it's an acquaintance, they stop, they sit, they talk. It's a completely different culture, a completely different mindset. In your opinion, does that reflect on everything else if we just were to focus on coffee?
Yes. Oh, I think it really does, because we have Starbucks in Copenhagen, but we have a ton of other coffee places, and they are really wonderful to go to. And a lot of them really almost function as a kind of community center. They usually spread out into the street with tables and so on outside. And even when it's cold, people like to sit outside. Some of them still smoke, few people, so that's a reason too. But there will be literary magazines or books and other things in those places. Often very good food, and in many of them actually also, unlike here, they serve alcohol if you're interested in that. And there is a long tradition. When I was young, and I was in art school in Copenhagen there, even though I was 16 years old, we would sometimes just go to a nearby, in the evening late, to a nearby bar. There was still not the coffee scene. We're in the early 60s, but we would go to the bar and drink a few beers and have a lot of discussions about art and so on. So that was a way that artists stay in touch with each other. So these were basically the bar scene. And they're very famous ones in Denmark, Copenhagen, and people still go to them, but they are kind of tourist attractions in some ways too. But the coffee scene is rich, and one development that has happened too is that some of the coffee places are also bookshops, and some of them only have alternative books, for example, of small presses, which is another wonderful development. It's a struggling one, but we have really big publishing houses, but there are a lot of alternative publishing houses too. And somehow they survive. There is some state funding, but actually there's a very generous funding system in Denmark too that comes from different funds and trusts and so on that are set up specifically to make sure that museums and alternative publishing and so on is thriving. There's a rich culture there.
I sometimes think that American culture is oxymoronic. I don't by any means consider myself an intellectual. When with my art and so on and so forth, it is what it is. I've tried to not overthink it. I'm in a stage of transition now, something I'd like to discuss with you over coffee when that's going to be possible. Sure. But bringing me to another point about you, the artist's statement. To me, writing an artist statement, I'd rather have my nails pulled out, my fingernails pulled out, and I'd rather pull out my own fingernails reading someone else's artist statement except for yours.
Yeah.
And I can't. It's the narrative. It's a whole different approach to writing a statement. And as a former instructor, as a painter, an artist, what is the purpose of the artist statement?
Well, it's in some ways, I would say, to put it back on the artist, is to clarify really who you are, what your process is, and what motivates you, and what you have been pursuing. Of course, I have sort of made it my life work in many ways to help artists write their artist statements. And very early on, when I worked with artists, and I would have some kind of writing that just did not make much sense and so on. And I would have the student in my office, and I would say to the students, okay, tell me about your work. What is it you're working with right now? What are you doing? And all of a sudden, sort of they lifted this kind of having to write an art statement, lifted. And it's like, well, you know what I've been pursuing is I found this paint that has these quality to it. And I've been looking at this work by so-and-so, and I found I can create a space with this paint that is fluid if I use it in this way and if I push it like that. And then I realized I could cut it, and I could do this and could that. And I said, will you just continue on and write all that down? And then we will make a whole big thing about what you are, an artist, and out of that we'll make your art statement. So many ways it is an artist just has to explain to himself, herself, what they're doing. And out of that comes a statement. But the galleries, of course, I've worked in the galleries too. I've worked on Newbury Street at the Impressions Gallery, and many ways working as a curator, you're writing text about artists, and in that way you promote them. That is what your job is as a curator. Mm-hmm. But I find you write the artist statement to, there is always something that is really significant about you as an individual. We're all unique. And we all have, even if we talk about maybe a poverty on some level, on certain things, when we pursue something, we have a uniqueness, and we have an individuality, and we have a desire and a way of expressing ourselves. And really, that is what you need to talk about and explain. And again, as I said, there's no reason not to totally acknowledge all your influences. There comes this kind of famous fear of influence. And I remember early on at Bristol, I had a student that said, I'm not influenced by anything. And I said, okay, you're not influenced by anything. And he really sort of meant it. And then I sat down with him and talked about what he looked at, the music. And he said, oh, I see what you mean. Now I understand what you mean, you know. And I said, it can be music. It can be the way the music is making an emotional statement for you in this way or that way. And so, of course, moved him into the territory of art. And he realized that he was influenced. But there was also this kind of fear of being influenced because, you know, as I said, an artist, you kind of want to be unique. I'm different from anybody else. And so on. And you are not unique. And yes, you are unique. You are both. But the thing is to clarify for yourself, what is it that makes you unique?
Yeah, it's well, you know the story. In fact, I'm getting closer and closer to get David Richardson on the show. Okay. And he pretty much, to use a very bad analogy, rubbed my nose in it. The connection of Cy Twombly, which is an honor to be, you know, but I never saw the man's work. I didn't know who he was at the time when someone said at the University of Miami, God, it looks just like Cy Twombly. I thought he was another student, and I just put on blinders like, no, I don't want him in my head. And then it was always Cy Twombly. I was being chased by this ghost, and David said, you have to look at him. I said, I can't do it. I can't do it. I don't want him in my head. I don't want him anywhere near me. I've seen a couple of examples, and that's it. You know, and then the weird thing is, there were a lot of other parallels the way we work. He would not. I don't consider myself going dry, but I have nothing to say. Sometimes I'll go 2-3 months without approaching the easel, and then if I start to tidy up, I know what's coming. It's a tsunami, and then I will just pour myself into it. And you know, I knocked out 30-something paintings for Luis in like 40 days or something. a couple of years back. That's how I met Luis. But the point is, how is it possible that I could have been influenced by a person I had never seen? And that's when
this is actually interesting because that is what I call a vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
And Cy Twombly didn't invent his vocabulary either. Like you didn't in many ways invent yours. You're participating in a vocabulary. So there really is a way of looking at his art, your art, and look at really what happened in the 50s when a lot of influence from Japan on calligraphy, and also in Europe, what was called an art autre, an art of the other, which was sort of an alternative type of abstraction, and the roots of that, which is sort of parallel with the New York School. And this is why it is so important. It is to dive into, and for you, for example, yes, you should look at Cy Twombly, but one of the reasons you should look at him too is to look at what his sources are. Where did he come from? And I actually had, I always, in the graduate seminar, I would ask each student to find an artist that they lately had become really fascinated by. And sometimes they were coy about it, and they didn't really want to tell me who they sort of had discovered lately. And I had one student, and she suggested different people. I said, it can't be an artist you know well. It is somebody you are now attracted to. And she sort of hemmed and hawed and said, well, of course, there's also Anne Hamilton, which is this incredible installation artist. And what do you mean with this also Anne Hamilton? And she said, well, I don't want to, I'm afraid of getting too close to it, like you said. So I said, you have to present on Anne Hamilton. And she did a wonderful presentation for the class of what Anne Hamilton's thoughts are, what her ideas was, where she came from. And in the end, she turned to me and she said, Lasse, you know, it's interesting because I'm kind of actually disappointed in Anne Hamilton. And I said to her, well, I knew you would be. And she looked baffled and she said, why? I said, because you thought she had done your work. She didn't do your work. It's just that something in her resonated and you realized she is on something that you need to go on, but she didn't walk the road you need to walk. Yeah. And I really firmly believe that's the way it is in life.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I think too. You know, we speak about the emerging artists and the established artists, and you know, we have these stages of life, and along with it, I mean, you know, the naivete of our early work, and then as we start to mature, the work hopefully starts to follow suit as well. So it is quite interesting. We're getting to the end of our session, sadly, but as I tell many of our guests, this has never been, well, actually, the original intent was how many artists could I get on, but now I early on discovered that it's not a one and done, that each guest is not a page in this book, this history book that we're trying to write of the history of creativity in this area. Some people are chapters and multiple chapters in volumes. You follow suit with that, you know, multiple volumes, and I'd love to be able to have you back. Of course, I also would love to have Elin on the show because there's another interesting aspect to your life. I'm looking more and more into doing some shows. Well, first doing the individuals in the couple separately and then doing them as a couple, because I'm finding with my wife being a graphic designer and so much more, that, wow, there's a very, very interesting partnership, a very interesting path that we're walking as we go along.
I hope you will. Yeah, I'd love to have you have Ellen on because actually before me, her roots are quite, even though she didn't grow up in New Bedford, are quite deep in the cultural history and the textiles and so on of New Bedford. And as you might know, Ellen and I had a residency in 2018 together in Denmark. And we pursued a project there of dyeing fabric with apple leaves, apple bark, and so on, one specific apple tree. And we're making the work together out of that. And so that's a wonderful project that we're working on right now. So it could be fun to talk about it.
Yeah, it would. It would. That's for sure. That's for sure. That brings us to the end of another excellent podcast. And this is Ron Fortier, thanking you for joining us. Hope to have you join us again for our next guest artist. And with that in mind, thank you very much and have a great day.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be the artist you believe you are, and let's take care of each other out there.